There's a moment, and very few people talk about it, where a guard steps forward and says nothing, just steps forward. That's usually enough. But this time, it wasn't enough. This time, the person on the other side of that door didn't step back. And what happened next, quietly, without cameras, without a single official statement, has been carried by the people who witnessed it ever since. Some things in that palace don't get written down. This is one of them.
It started the way most things do inside those walls, slowly, without anyone realizing it was starting at all. The afternoon had been long, one of those grey London days where the light never quite arrives and the corridors feel narrower than they are. There had been a family gathering, not a formal one, not the kind with press briefings and coordinated outfits, the quieter sort, the kind that happens behind schedules and closed diaries. Princess Charlotte had been there. She was young enough that the adults around her still spoke in that particular way people do when they're trying not to be overheard by children. But children notice. They always do. She had been taken upstairs earlier than expected. That detail matters, because it meant that when the rest of the afternoon unfolded, she was already somewhere she was supposed to be safe. Her room, her floor, her space. If this kind of story stays with you, the ones that never quite made it into the papers, there's more where this came from. Subscribing just means you won't miss the next one, that's all. The guard assigned to that corridor that afternoon was not a new posting. He had been in royal service long enough to understand something that takes years to learn properly, that his job was not simply to stand still, it was to read a room, read a hallway, read the weight of footsteps before they turned the corner. So when he heard them, measured, deliberate, moving with the particular confidence of someone who expected not to be questioned, he was already paying attention. He recognized her before he saw her clearly. Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall at that time, though the title would change, she was moving with purpose. A lady in waiting a half step behind. No particular announcement. No request passed through the usual channels. She was simply heading towards Charlotte's room. The guard didn't move immediately. That matters too, because there's a version of this where he simply steps aside, where he nods where the door opens, where nothing becomes a story. But something stopped him. Not protocol exactly. Not a rule he could have quoted chapter and verse. Something quieter than that. He had seen the schedule. Charlotte was resting. No visitors had been cleared for that floor. Not for that hour, not for that room. And no one had told him to expect her. He straightened, just slightly. She didn't slow down. She was perhaps 4 feet away when he moved. Not dramatically. Not with any of the stiffness people imagine when they picture palace guards. He simply shifted his weight, just enough to make the space in front of the door feel occupied in a way it hadn't been a second before. She noticed. Of course she noticed. There was a pause. The kind that has its own particular texture inside those buildings. Not awkward, not hostile, but loaded. Full of things unsaid and rank, unspoken, and history that lives in the walls. The lady in waiting had stopped too, a little further back. Camilla looked at him. He looked with professional stillness, somewhere just past her. "I'm going to look in on the child," she said. That was how it was phrased, apparently. The child. Not Charlotte, not her name. The child. The guard said nothing for a moment. That silence was its own kind of answer. But then, quietly, evenly, with the careful tone of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and what it might cost him, he spoke. He told her the corridor was restricted. She blinked. It was a small thing. But people who were later told about this moment always stopped at that detail. The blink. Because it suggested just for a second that she hadn't expected to be spoken to at all. "I beg your pardon?" she said. He repeated it. No elaboration. No apology wrapped around it. Just the information. Plain and clear. The corridor was restricted for the afternoon. No visitors had been scheduled. The lady in waiting took a very small step backward. Camilla did not. She was not a woman easily made to feel unwelcome. That was simply true. Years of navigating a world that had, at various times, been openly hostile to her had made her extraordinarily good at holding her ground. Whatever she felt in that moment, her face held its shape, but something shifted in her posture, something faint. She said, and this is the line that gets repeated, "Do you know who I am?" Not shouted, not theatrical, just said. And the guard, this unremarkable, meticulous, quietly courageous man, said that yes, he did. And he did not move. The seconds after that were very still. The kind of still that feels, to anyone watching, like the moment before something either breaks or holds. It held. She turned eventually, unhurriedly, as though it had been her own decision from the start, but she turned.
The lady in waiting followed without looking back. The guard stood exactly where he was for a long time after the sound of their footsteps faded. He didn't relax his posture, didn't exhale loudly or glance around. He simply stayed, because they might come back, and he didn't yet know what would happen when the people upstairs found out what he'd done. Within the hour someone knew. That's always how it works. Nothing stays sealed in those corridors for long. Not really. There are too many people who are paid to be observant, too many ears that have learned to operate without appearing to listen. The incident, and it was already being called that to the incident, moved quietly upward through the household, not loudly, not in the form of a formal complaint, more like water finding its way through stone, slow, certain. A senior aide was informed, then another. No one seemed to be raising their voice.
That was what made those who heard about it feel uneasy. It's the quiet reactions in that world that carry weight. Raised voices mean emotion. Quiet means consideration. Consideration means consequences are being shaped. The guard, meanwhile, had been relieved at the end of his shift as normal. He was given no indication that anything was being discussed. He went home. Ate something, presumably. Slept, perhaps badly. He had a family, a wife, children of his own. He was not a man without something to lose. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the conversation about what to do with him had already happened, before he'd reached the end of his street. Inside the palace, the question wasn't simply whether he'd overstepped. The question was more careful than that, more loyally. Had he followed protocol? Yes. Was there a standing order covering the situation? Technically, yes. Was the corridor genuinely restricted? It was. So on paper, on clean, undeniable paper, he had done exactly what he was supposed to do. That should have ended it. But there are papers. And then there are conversations that never become papers. Charlotte, during all of this, knew nothing. She had spent the afternoon in her room, drawing apparently, or reading, something quiet. She emerged for dinner in the way children do, slightly rumpled and indifferent to the particular tensions adults have spent the afternoon constructing. If her parents knew what had happened, they didn't show it in front of her, but William knew. He was told that evening, told the shape of it, that a guard had stopped Camilla from entering Charlotte's room, that words had been exchanged, that she had eventually left. The details of his reaction are not entirely clear. That's always the way with William. The emotional current runs deep and controlled and rarely surfaces in ways that get recorded. But people close to him describe something that wasn't anger. It was closer to stillness, the same kind of stillness the guard had held in that corridor, which meant something. Even then, even before anyone fully understood what it meant, there is something people don't always appreciate about the way decisions get made inside the royal family. They rarely arrive as decisions, they arrive as atmospheres. Gradual shifts in who stands where, who speaks first in a room, whose name gets attached to which arrangement. It's a language built over centuries for people who couldn't afford to be explicit, and the ones who've grown up inside it, really inside it, read it without thinking. William had grown up inside it. Camilla had learned it later, impeccably well by most accounts. But there's a difference between fluency and native knowledge, and sometimes in the quiet moments that difference surfaces. The guard's situation was quietly resolved. His record remained clean. That detail, that small, deliberately placed detail, told its own story to those who understood the language. He hadn't been sacrificed. He had been protected. Not with ceremony, not with gratitude expressed through any formal channel, just with the absence of consequence where consequence could very easily have been arranged. Charlotte, meanwhile, continued her childhood in the way royal children do, with a degree of structure that most people would find suffocating, and with small freedoms carved out inside it that were fiercely, if invisibly, guarded. She was not told, in any direct sense, what had happened that afternoon, but children absorb what they're not told. They learn the shape of the silences around them, the doors that don't get discussed, the names that make the air in a room change slightly.
Charlotte, by all accounts, was exceptionally good at reading rooms. She had been from very young. There were people in that household who said, privately, carefully, that she was the one who watched everything. Not Charles, not William, not any of the senior members. Charlotte, quiet, precise, missing very little. What she made of it all is impossible to know, but she made something. The weeks that followed were careful ones, not hostile. Carefully normal, which is its own distinct thing. Events proceeded as planned. Appearances were managed. Photographs showed the expected arrangements, but those who spent time in those rooms noticed that certain proximities had shifted. Subtly, inexplicably, on the surface. The guard continued his posting. No one spoke to him directly about what had happened. No acknowledgement, no conversation. The incident existed in any official sense as though it hadn't, but occasionally, and the people who noticed this always did so with a particular tone. Occasionally, if he was on duty near the family, William would catch his eye. Not for long, just a moment, and then look away. That was all. But inside that world, that was not nothing. There is a version of this story, the comfortable version, where the whole thing gets explained by protocol, by procedure, by a young guard who followed the rules and a situation that got tidied away cleanly. That version exists, it's just not the only one. Because the question that nobody asked officially, the question that doesn't fit into incident reports or debriefs, is why Camilla was there in the first place, not in the building, not in the family's orbit, there, that corridor, that floor, that door, unannounced, without clearance. On an afternoon when Charlotte had been taken upstairs specifically because the adults needed the rooms below to be certain things, there is no clean answer to that question, which is not the same as there being no answer at all. People who have spent years close to that world will tell you, always quietly, always in the third or fourth exchange of a longer conversation, that the relationships inside the royal family are not simply what they appear in the footage, that what's shown at Trooping the Colour is not the same as what moves through those back corridors at 4 in the afternoon, that the careful smiles in the balcony photographs are themselves a kind of language, and what they're translating often is something considerably more complicated. Camilla, by the time of this incident, was not a newcomer. She was not unfamiliar with the geography of those spaces. She knew which floors were which. She knew how the afternoons were structured. She knew the schedule. That's the part that sits uneasily. Not that she arrived. People arrive. Households move. Plans shift. People take different routes through the same building. But this was deliberate movement, toward a specific door, on a specific afternoon. And the only thing that stopped it was one man who decided, for reasons he may not have been fully able to articulate in the moment, that something felt wrong. Not against the rules, against something quieter, something more like instinct, the kind of instinct that takes years to develop, and once developed is almost impossible to explain to someone who doesn't already understand it. He felt it, he acted on it, and the people who mattered, the people who understood what it meant, responded to it in the only way they could, within the language available to them. They let him keep his post, which meant you were right, which meant we saw it too, which meant everything. Years pass in those households the way they always do, layered over each other, one formal portrait at a time. What happened that afternoon doesn't appear anywhere you find it. It wasn't leaked, wasn't given to a journalist as background, wasn't threaded through a memoir, even distantly. It simply became one of the things that happened and was known quietly by a small number of people who understood its shape. But those people remember it, the way you remember the moment a door almost opened that shouldn't have, the way a near miss stays with you longer than an accident sometimes, because you're left carrying the weight of what didn't happen, of what was prevented, of what might have been and wasn't. Charlotte is older now. The image she presents to the world is composed and careful, and in the way of her father, remarkably skilled at giving very little away. She stands at the right distances. She says the expected things at the expected moments.
She has learned the language of that world with a fluency that seems increasingly to be native, but occasionally, in a photograph, in a clip, in one of those small unguarded seconds that cameras sometimes catch before anyone notices, there's something behind her eyes that is harder to categorize.
Watchfulness, maybe. The particular alertness of someone who learned earlier than they should have, that not all doors are equally safe, that not all people who move towards you with purpose are moving towards you with kindness, that the most important people in a room are sometimes not the loudest or the most prominent. Sometimes they're the ones standing quietly in a corridor, deciding where to put their feet, and refusing, at considerable personal cost and without any applause, to move. The guard's name doesn't appear in this story, that's not an accident. Some kinds of courage are most honoured by being kept safe, and some truths in that world survive precisely because no one writes them down.
If this story made you feel something, if it sat with you the way it sat with me, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We don't do noise here, we don't do gossip dressed up as history. We do the stories that were never meant to surface, the ones carried quietly for years before someone finally said them out loud. There are more of them. If you want to be there when the next one comes, subscribe. It's a small thing, but it means you won't miss what comes next, and something tells me you won't want to.